The woman in white walked into court smiling, because she thought she was about to take everything from the man she had already broken. Cameras flashed outside the Manhattan courthouse as Victoria Whitmore stepped from a black town car. Her chin lifted, her diamond wedding ring still bright on her left hand, as if the marriage had not turned into a battlefield of lawyers, headlines, and carefully rehearsed tears. She wore a white designer suit, the kind of white that looked innocent from a distance and expensive up close. Reporters called her name from behind the barricades. "Mrs. Whitmore, do you expect a fair settlement today?" Victoria paused just long enough for the cameras to catch the softness in her eyes. "I only want what is right," she said, her voice gentle, wounded, perfect. Then she turned and walked inside like a woman entering a room she already owned. Across the marble lobby, Ethan Whitmore sat on a wooden bench with his hands folded, looking nothing like the billionaire the tabloids loved to hate. No bodyguards, no entourage, no board members standing behind him. His navy suit fit perfectly, but his face looked tired, sharpened by months of public judgment. On every screen in America, he had been painted as cold, controlling, and heartless. The CEO who built Whitmore Holdings into a $4 billion empire now looked like a man waiting to be erased from his own life. Behind him stood Grace Miller, 27, quiet, white, and almost invisible in a gray coat she had bought on clearance 2 winters ago. She held a dented cardboard file box against her chest with both arms, as if it weighed more than paper. To everyone else, she was just Ethan's low-level legal assistant, the poor girl who stayed after the famous lawyers quit. But Grace knew something no one in that courthouse knew. Buried beneath old tax folders, charity records, and yellowed estate papers was one document Victoria had spent 3 years trying to make disappear. Victoria noticed her and smiled as she passed. Not warmly, not kindly. The smile was thin enough to cut glass. She leaned close, perfume cold and expensive. "Sweetheart," Victoria whispered. "Paper cannot save a broken man." Grace did not answer. Her fingers tightened around the box, and for 1 second she felt the sharp corner of the sealed envelope press through the cardboard into her palm. Ethan looked up at her, his blue eyes tired but steady. "You do not have to stand here with me," he said quietly. Grace swallowed. The courtroom doors opened ahead of them, and the low murmur inside rolled out like thunder before a storm. "Yes," she said, almost under her breath. "I do." Because 3 nights earlier, in a locked storage room on the 42nd floor of Whitmore Tower, Grace had found a silver pen, a hidden key, and a letter from Ethan's dead mother marked with one instruction: "Open only if this marriage ends in court." Now Victoria walked toward the judge with absolute confidence, ready to claim half the company, the family estate in Connecticut, and control of the charity Ethan's mother had built from nothing. She thought the story was already written. She thought Grace was nobody. She thought Ethan was too ashamed to fight. But as the bailiff called the room to order and everyone rose, Grace set the battered box on the defense table with a soft, final thud. Victoria glanced back, still smiling. Then Grace opened the lid. The judge entered, and the room settled into a silence so heavy Grace could hear the tiny scrape of Victoria's bracelet against the polished table. Ethan stood beside her, shoulders squared, face calm, but Grace could see the truth in the small details no camera ever caught. The pale line across his knuckles where his wedding ring used to sit, the way his jaw tightened whenever Victoria's attorney said the word abandonment, the way he looked at the floor instead of the woman who had promised to love him. For 8 months, America had watched the divorce unfold like a scandal show. Victoria had given interviews from the steps of charity galas, always dressed softly, always speaking carefully, telling the world she had survived a marriage built on power instead of affection. Ethan had said almost nothing. Silence in the court of public opinion looked like guilt. Whitmore Holdings had lost nearly $600 million in market value. 2 board members had resigned. A children's literacy foundation named after Ethan's mother, Margaret Whitmore, was now frozen under legal review because Victoria claimed she had helped build it. Grace knew that lie hurt Ethan more than the money. She had seen him alone in his office after midnight, staring at a framed photograph of his mother cutting a ribbon outside the first community library she ever funded in Queens. He had not known Grace was watching from the doorway that night. He had simply whispered, "I am sorry, Mom." That was the moment Grace stopped seeing him as a billionaire protected by glass walls, and started seeing him as a son who had been cornered into losing the last clean piece of his family. Victoria's attorney rose first, a silver-haired man named Charles Benton who spoke with the smooth confidence of someone who billed by the hour and never doubted he was worth it. He painted Ethan as distant, calculating, emotionally absent. He presented photographs of Victoria standing alone at events, carefully chosen messages without context, and a statement from a former house manager claiming Ethan treated marriage like a business arrangement. Victoria lowered her eyes at exactly the right moments. Once she pressed a tissue beneath her lashes, though Grace did not see a single tear fall. Then Benton turned toward the judge and said Victoria was seeking half of Ethan's voting shares, the Connecticut estate, and sole authority over the Margaret Whitmore Foundation. Ethan's attorney objected, but even his voice sounded tired. Grace felt the room leaning toward Victoria, just as the tabloids had. A beautiful wife. A cold, rich husband. A simple story people already believed. Ethan did not move. He looked like a man who had learned that defending himself only made the crowd louder. Grace opened the box slowly beneath the table. Her fingers brushed old folders, paper clips, a cracked leather binder. Then the sealed envelope from Margaret Whitmore. For a second she remembered the storage room where she had found it. Dust floating in the flashlight beam, rain tapping the windows 42 floors above Park Avenue, and that silver pen resting inside a velvet case with the words "for truth, not power" engraved along its side. Grace had almost left it there. It felt too private, too sacred, like touching a wand that belonged to someone else. But then she had found the hidden key tucked inside the pen case, and the small wall safe behind Margaret's portrait had opened with a click that seemed to echo through the whole empty floor. Inside was the envelope, a copy of the prenuptial agreement, and a letter written in Margaret's elegant hand. Grace had read only the first line before her throat tightened. "My son will protect everyone except himself." Now in court, Victoria's voice broke through the memory. "I never wanted his money," she said softly from the witness stand. "I only wanted dignity." Grace looked up. Ethan closed his eyes. And in that instant, Grace knew Victoria was not just asking for a settlement. She was trying to rewrite a dead woman's legacy in front of everyone who had ever loved her. Grace kept her eyes on Victoria as Charles Benton guided her through the testimony, each question polished until it sounded almost tender. "Did you feel isolated in the marriage?" he asked. Victoria nodded. "Constantly." "Did Mr. Whitmore control the household finances?" "He controlled everything." "Did he ever make you feel equal?" Victoria lowered her gaze, letting the silence do the work before she whispered. No. A low murmur moved through the gallery, and Grace felt Ethan shift beside her. Not anger. Not surprise. Just that same quiet exhaustion, the kind that came when a lie had been repeated so many times it began to feel heavier than the truth. Grace glanced at the box again. The silver pen was wrapped in a soft cloth, lying beside Margaret Whitmore's envelope like a sleeping witness. She remembered the first time Ethan had mentioned his mother. It had been 2 months earlier, long after midnight, when Grace found him in the records room reviewing old foundation grants by himself. He was wearing shirt sleeves, his tie loosened, a paper coffee cup untouched beside him. "She used to say money was only useful if it moved toward someone who needed it," he had said, not looking up. Grace had not known what to say. Men like Ethan Whitmore were supposed to speak in numbers, deals, and profit margins. But that night, his voice softened around his mother's name like a hand closing around something fragile. Now Victoria was trying to take that too. Not just the company. Not just the estate. The story. The memory. The moral center of the Whitmore name. Benton placed a printed email on the display screen. It showed Ethan writing, "I cannot keep pretending this marriage is working." Benton turned to the judge. "A clear admission that Mr. Whitmore had emotionally abandoned my client." Grace's stomach tightened. She knew the rest of that email. The full sentence continued, "I cannot keep pretending this marriage is working while you pressure the foundation staff to redirect funds into events that only promote your image." Ethan's attorney objected, requesting the full email chain. But Benton smiled as if he had expected it. "Your Honor, we provided what was relevant to Mrs. Whitmore's emotional distress." Relevant? Grace almost laughed, but the sound caught in her throat. That was how Victoria had survived. Not by inventing everything. By cutting truth into pieces small enough to serve her. Then Victoria's eyes found Grace again. This time there was no smile. Only warning. Grace felt a memory rise sharp and recent. Victoria in the courthouse parking garage the night before, standing beside a sleek black car while rainwater streamed down the concrete pillars. Grace had been walking toward the subway, clutching her canvas bag, when Victoria stepped from the shadows with an envelope in her hand. "You look tired," Victoria had said. "I know your father's medical bills are not getting smaller." Grace had frozen. She had never told Victoria about her father. "There is $50,000 in cashier's checks inside this envelope," Victoria continued. "Enough to pay the hospital, fix your credit, maybe even move out of that apartment with the radiator that barely works." Grace remembered the shame of wanting to reach for it. Not because she was greedy, because her father had worked 30 years as a school janitor, and now measured his medicine in skip doses and quiet apologies. Victoria had leaned closer. "All you have to do is misplace one old envelope. Men like Ethan do not marry girls like you. But money can still love you, Grace." For one heartbeat, Grace had seen the life that money could buy. Heat that worked. Groceries without counting dollars. Her father sleeping without pain in a clean room with fresh curtains. Then she had thought of Margaret's letter. "My son will protect everyone except himself." Grace had taken the envelope from Victoria's hand, torn it cleanly in half, and let the pieces fall into the rain. Now, sitting in court, she felt the same tremble in her fingers, but she did not hide it. Courage was not the absence of shaking. Sometimes it was shaking and opening the file anyway. Grace slipped the sealed envelope from the box, keeping it low against the table, and for the first time that morning Ethan turned fully toward her. His eyes dropped to the cream-colored paper, then to the familiar handwriting across the front. The change in his face was so small most people would have missed it, but Grace saw it. The breath caught. The shoulders loosened and tightened again. The son inside the billionaire recognized his mother before the court ever heard her name. "Where did you get that?" he whispered. "In her old office," Grace said softly. "Behind the portrait." Ethan stared at the envelope as if it had reached through 3 years of grief and touched him on the chest. "You should not have opened it." "I did not," Grace replied. "Not the letter. Only the safe." His attorney Martin Hale leaned closer, suddenly alert. "Is that what I think it is?" Grace nodded once. Across the aisle Victoria watched them, and the calm mask she had worn all morning flickered. "Just once. But enough." Benton continued speaking, unaware that the center of the room had shifted. "My client gave years of loyalty to a man who treated marriage like an acquisition," he said. "She entered that home with love. She left it with nothing but humiliation." Grace heard Victoria inhale slowly, regaining control. Then Ethan's voice cut through the courtroom, low but clear. "That is not true." Every head turned. It was the first full sentence he had spoken since the hearing began. Benton smiled. "Mr. Whitmore, your counsel will have time to respond." Ethan did not look at him. He looked at Victoria. "You did not enter my home with love." Victoria's expression softened instantly, performing heartbreak as naturally as breathing. "Ethan, please do not do this." The judge raised a hand. "Counsel, approach if there is new evidence to be addressed." Martin stood, buttoning his jacket. Grace rose with him, holding the envelope and the silver pen wrapped in cloth. Her knees felt weak, but each step toward the bench steadied her. She was not walking for money, not for status, not even for Ethan alone. She was walking for the woman who had hidden truth behind a painted smile on a wall, trusting that someday someone ordinary would care enough to find it. Martin presented the documents for review, explaining the chain of custody. Margaret Whitmore's private office, the locked safe, the engraved key inside the pen case, the sealed envelope marked for court. Benton objected immediately, calling it suspicious, untimely, prejudicial. His voice sharpened with every word. "Your Honor, this is a theatrical stunt by a desperate team losing ground." Victoria kept her face composed, but her fingers curled around the edge of the table. The judge studied the envelope, then the engraved pen, then Grace. "Miss Miller, did you alter, scan, copy, or distribute these materials before today?" Grace felt the weight of the entire room settle on her. "No, Your Honor." "Did anyone instruct you to conceal them?" "No, Your Honor." "Why bring them now?" Grace looked once at Ethan. He looked afraid, not for his fortune, but for his mother's memory. That nearly broke her. But then she remembered Victoria's words in the parking garage. Paper cannot save a broken man. Grace lifted her chin. Because Mrs. Whitmore is asking this court to award her control of a foundation she may have tried to compromise. And I believe Mrs. Whitmore knew these documents existed before today. A ripple passed through the gallery. Victoria stood so quickly her chair scraped the floor. That is disgusting, she said, voice trembling with outrage. She is lying because she wants him. The words landed like a match dropped on dry paper. Cameras were not allowed inside, but every reporter in the back row leaned forward as if the air itself had become news. Ethan's face went pale. Grace felt heat rise into her cheeks, not from guilt, but from the humiliation Victoria had aimed with perfect precision. Poor girl. Young assistant. Rich employer. It was an old story, easy to believe, easy to stain. Victoria turned to the judge, tears finally shining in her eyes. Your Honor, this woman has been in his office late at night. She has access to his private files. She has every reason to create evidence that protects him and benefits herself. Grace stood very still. For a moment, the envelope in her hands felt fragile again. Then her thumb brushed the silver pen beneath the cloth, and she remembered the engraved words. For truth, not power. The accusation hung in the courtroom longer than it deserved, because lies spoken with confidence always need a moment to show their shape. Grace felt every eye on her, from the reporters in the back row to the clerk beside the judge, and for one painful second she was back in her small apartment in Queens, standing beside a radiator that clanked all night but barely gave heat, counting the dollars left after rent, groceries, and her father's prescriptions. Victoria knew exactly what she was doing. She was not arguing evidence anymore. She was putting Grace on trial. The poor assistant. The ambitious girl. The nobody who dared touch the private papers of a billionaire family. Ethan rose halfway from his chair, anger breaking through his careful control. Stop it, he said, his voice rough. Martin placed a hand near his sleeve, warning him to sit, but Ethan did not look at his lawyer. He looked at Grace. She has done nothing except tell the truth. Victoria gave a small wounded laugh. Of course you would defend her. Benton stepped in smoothly. Your Honor, this is precisely why the source of these documents must be questioned. Miss Miller's personal closeness to Mr. Whitmore creates a serious credibility issue. Grace felt the words personal closeness slide across the room like oil. She wanted to explain every late night. The subpoena logs. The foundation records. The boxes no one else would organize because the case had become too ugly and too public. She wanted to say that she had eaten vending machine crackers for dinner while Ethan sat 3 rooms away, not knowing she was still there. She wanted to say there had been no secret romance, no hidden arrangement, no promise of reward. Only work. Only conscience. But the more a poor woman explained herself in a rich person's war, the smaller she could sound. So Grace did not rush. She unwrapped the silver pen and placed it on the counsel table. The metal caught the courtroom light, clean and quiet. Your Honor, she said, I understand why Mrs. Whitmore would question me. If I were in her position, I might question me too. Victoria blinked, thrown off by the calmness. Grace continued. That is why I did not bring only my word. Martin turned toward her. Grace. She looked at him, then at Ethan. Mrs. Whitmore said I created evidence. I did not. But Margaret Whitmore expected this exact accusation. Ethan's face changed. What do you mean? Grace touched the engraving with her thumb. The pen is not just a pen. The judge leaned forward. Benton's smile faded. Grace turned to Martin and lowered her voice, but the room was so still everyone heard her. When I found the safe, there was a note inside the velvet case. It said the pen was used during private signings because Margaret did not trust people who smiled too easily around money. A few people in the gallery shifted. Victoria's eyes dropped to the pen, and this time she could not hide the fear quickly enough. Grace saw it. So did Ethan. Martin requested permission to submit the device for review. Benton objected again, louder now, calling it invasive, irrelevant, and impossible to authenticate. The judge did not rule immediately. She asked the court technician to examine the pen under supervision, and the minutes that followed felt longer than the entire morning. No one spoke. Ethan sat with his hands clasped tightly, staring at the object his mother had left behind. Grace stood beside the table, trying not to think about her father's hospital bill folded in her purse, or Victoria's torn check soaking in a parking garage trash bin, or the way the world always seemed to ask honest people to prove themselves twice. Finally, the technician looked up. Your Honor, there is an encrypted storage component built into the barrel. It contains one video file and one audio file. The courtroom air seemed to drop 10 degrees. Victoria whispered something to Benton, but he did not answer. Ethan closed his eyes and Grace saw the last trace of doubt leave his face. The judge gave a single nod. Play the video. The video appeared on the courtroom screen in a pale rectangle of light, slightly grainy, dated 3 years earlier, recorded inside Margaret Whitmore's private office. For a moment no one moved. The room on the screen was exactly as Ethan remembered it. The green-shaded lamp on the mahogany desk, the framed photograph of the first library his mother funded in Queens, the rain-speckled windows looking out over Park Avenue, and Margaret herself seated straight-backed behind the desk, elegant, calm, already thinner from the illness she had hidden longer than she should have. Ethan stopped breathing. Grace saw it happen. His whole face softened with a grief so private it almost felt wrong to witness. On the screen, Victoria sat across from Margaret in a cream dress, her hair pinned perfectly, her smile bright enough to look sincere. A young attorney placed several documents on the desk. Margaret slid the silver pen toward Victoria. This clause protects the foundation, Margaret said in the recording, her voice clear though tired. It protects Ethan too, but mostly it protects the work. If this marriage ends honestly, you will be treated generously. If it ends through fraud, manipulation, or deliberate damage to the family's charitable assets, you receive nothing from those assets. Do you understand? Victoria's recorded smile did not falter. Of course. I would never hurt Ethan or your foundation. In the present courtroom, Victoria's face had gone still. Not pale. Not shaking. Just emptied, like someone had pulled the performance out of her and left only calculation behind. The video continued. Victoria signed each page with Margaret's pen. The camera captured her hand clearly, the diamond bracelet on her wrist, the full document title, the date, the notary stamp, the initials in the margin. Benton stood slowly. Your Honor, we need to verify whether this file has been edited. The judge raised one hand without looking away from the screen. You will have that opportunity. Sit down, counsel. The video did not end. That was what changed everything. After the signing, the attorney stepped out to make copies. Margaret remained seated. Victoria reached for her purse, then paused when Margaret coughed softly. You are very careful, Victoria said in the recording, her voice lighter now, less polished. Margaret looked at her for a long second. Careful people keep families safe. Victoria gave a quiet laugh. Sometimes careful people just make things slower. Grace felt Ethan's hand grip the edge of the table. On screen, Margaret did not respond. Victoria leaned back, crossing one ankle over the other. You think I do not know what people say about me? The model who got lucky. The social climber. The girl who smiled her way into old money. Margaret's expression remained unreadable. I think people reveal themselves when they believe no one important is listening. Victoria's smile sharpened. Then listen carefully. Ethan is generous when he feels guilty. He is even more generous when he feels alone. Once you are gone, and once he is emotionally broken, he will give me anything to make the noise stop. The courtroom froze. No coughs. No whispers. No shifting papers. Even the judge looked up from her notes. Ethan stared at the screen as if the words had crossed years to reach him fresh. Grace wanted to touch his sleeve, but she did not. This was his moment to stand inside the truth, painful as it was, without anyone softening it for him. On the screen, Margaret's voice stayed quiet. That is a cruel thing to say about the man you are about to marry. Victoria stood, smoothing her dress. It is not cruel. It is strategy. The video ended there, leaving only the blank blue glow of the screen. For several seconds, the courtroom seemed unable to remember how sound worked. Then the judge turned toward Victoria. Mrs. Whitmore, your testimony under oath was that you entered this marriage without knowledge of any special asset protection clause. Victoria opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Benton leaned toward her urgently. Ethan finally looked away from the screen and down at the silver pen on the table. The object no longer looked expensive. It looked loyal. Grace closed the file box with both hands, and the soft click sounded like a door locking behind a lie that had lived too long. Victoria's silence did more damage than any confession could have done. For nearly a full minute, the woman who had controlled every room with a glance could not find one sentence strong enough to rescue her. Her attorney asked for a recess, his voice tight now, no longer smooth, but the judge denied it until the current evidence was fully entered into the record. The video file, the audio file, the signed agreement, the notary page, and the letter from Margaret Whitmore were all marked one by one, each exhibit number landing like another stone removed from Ethan's chest. Victoria finally tried to speak. "That was years ago," she said. "People say things they do not mean." The judge looked at her over the rim of her glasses. "People also testify under oath, Mrs. Whitmore." The words were calm, but they changed the temperature of the room. Ethan did not smile. That was what surprised Grace most. He did not lean back in victory, did not look at Victoria with satisfaction, did not even seem relieved in the way people expected rich men to be relieved when money was saved. He looked wounded, yes, but also awake, as if the truth had hurt him and returned him to himself at the same time. Benton attempted to narrow the damage, arguing that emotional statements made before a wedding could not erase years of marriage, but Martin rose with the full email chain, the foundation transfer requests, and the communications showing Victoria's team had prepared public accusations weeks before filing. The simple story cracked open. The abandoned wife was not abandoned. The cold husband had not controlled the money to punish her. He had blocked suspicious transfers from a children's literacy fund into luxury events disguised as charity promotions. The room began to understand. Grace saw it in the juror-like faces of the reporters, in the clerk's lowered eyes, in the way even Benton stopped looking directly at Victoria. Then Martin asked permission for Ethan to respond. Ethan stood slowly. For a second, he rested his fingertips near the silver pen, not touching it, just close enough that Grace knew he was thinking of his mother. "I loved my wife once," he said, his voice steady but quiet. "Maybe not perfectly. Maybe not loudly enough for cameras or parties. But I loved her with the life I knew how to offer. I protected her privacy. I protected this family's name. And when she began asking for things that would hurt the foundation, I told myself she was grieving with me. I was wrong." Victoria stared at the table. Ethan continued. "My mother built that foundation before I ever made my first million. She built it because she was a schoolteacher before she was a Whitmore. She believed books could give a child a window out of any room they felt trapped in. I will not let that work become a trophy in a divorce." Grace felt the sting of tears, but she kept her face still. This was not revenge. This was a man drawing a line around what was sacred. The judge ordered a formal review of the newly admitted evidence and suspended Victoria's claim to foundation control pending investigation. Her request for voting shares was frozen. Questions of false testimony and document concealment were referred for further legal review. No dramatic gavel strike came. No shouting. Just procedure, paper, and the quiet collapse of a lie that had dressed itself as suffering. When the hearing recessed, Victoria rose with stiff elegance, but the cameras waiting outside would no longer receive the performance she had planned. She passed Grace at the aisle close enough to whisper, "You think he will choose you now?" Grace met her eyes. "I did not do this to be chosen." For the first time, Victoria had no answer. Ethan heard it. He turned toward Grace and something changed between them, not sudden love, not a fairy tale, but recognition. He saw the woman who had been offered money, insulted in public, and still carried the truth into the room with shaking hands. "Grace," he said softly, "I do not know how to thank you." She looked down at the silver pen, then back at him. "Do not thank me by going back to being alone." Ethan's eyes filled, but he nodded once. Outside, the courthouse steps were crowded with reporters, microphones, and bright questions. This time, Ethan did not hide behind silence. He stepped forward with Grace beside him, not behind him, and when the first reporter shouted about victory, Ethan answered, "This was never about winning. It was about protecting what should never have been for sale." The statement on the courthouse steps did not sound like something crafted by a public relations team. It sounded plain, almost unfinished, and that was why every camera held on Ethan's face. For the first time in months, he was not letting someone else narrate his life. Grace stood half a step beside him, the cardboard file box in her arms, the silver pen sealed in an evidence pouch inside it. Wind moved through the crowd, lifting the edge of her gray coat, and she suddenly became aware of how strange the picture must look. A billionaire CEO and a clearance rack assistant standing shoulder to shoulder while an empire recalculated itself around a truth hidden in an old office wall. Reporters called questions about Victoria, about charges, about the company's stock, about whether Ethan planned to countersue. Ethan answered none of them with anger. "The court will handle the legal issues," he said. "My focus is protecting the foundation and the people it serves." Then a reporter shouted, "Who is the woman next to you?" Grace felt the question hit harder than the others. Ethan turned slightly, not possessive, not theatrical, just certain. "This is Grace Miller," he said. "She is the reason the truth reached the courtroom today." Cameras shifted toward her, and Grace fought the instinct to step back. She had spent most of her life trying not to take up space in rooms built for people with better shoes, brighter teeth, and last names that opened doors. But Ethan did not move in front of her. He did not hide her. He let her stand in the light and choose what to do with it. Grace looked at the microphones and said only, "I did what I hope anyone would do if they found the truth." It was not polished. It was not dramatic. But within an hour that line was everywhere. By evening the story had changed. Not completely, not cleanly, because public opinion never apologizes all at once, but enough. The headlines that once called Ethan ruthless now asked how Victoria had controlled the narrative for so long. The board issued a statement supporting the protection of the Margaret Whitmore Foundation. Donors who had paused their gifts began calling again. Teachers from Queens, Newark, and rural Pennsylvania sent emails about libraries Margaret had helped build. Ethan read those messages alone in his office until Grace came in with a folder and found him staring at one from a school principal in Ohio. "Your mother bought our first 1,000 books," the message said. "Some of our students held a new book for the first time because of her." Ethan set the paper down carefully. "I almost let Victoria take that away because I was tired." Grace stood across from him, the city glowing behind the windows. "You were not tired," she said. "You were grieving." He looked at her then, really looked, and the quiet between them felt different from the silence of the courtroom. Softer. Less afraid. "And you?" he asked. "What were you?" Grace smiled faintly. "Scared. Broke. Mostly running on bad coffee." Ethan almost laughed, and the sound surprised both of them. Then his expression grew serious. "She offered you money, did she not?" Grace did not answer right away. Her eyes dropped to the folder in her hands. "Enough to fix things at home for a while." "Your father?" She nodded. Ethan's jaw tightened, but she lifted a hand before he could speak. "Do not turn my decision into a debt you have to repay." He stopped. That mattered more than any check he could have written. Grace stepped closer to the desk. "I need a job, not rescue. I need a salary I earned, health insurance that is not a miracle, and a reason to believe this work does not end because the hearing ended." Ethan looked at the framed photograph of Margaret, then back at Grace. "Then help me build something that outlives the scandal." 2 weeks later, Whitmore Holdings announced a new legal aid program under the foundation, designed for people trapped in financial manipulation during divorce, inheritance disputes, and family business conflicts. Ethan offered Grace the director role in front of the full board, not as a favor, but with a file of her research, her case organization, and her recommendations placed before every executive. When one board member questioned her lack of pedigree, Ethan slid Grace's report across the table and said, "Pedigree did not save this foundation. Integrity did." Grace did not smile until she left the boardroom. Then she stepped into the hallway, pressed one hand against the wall, and breathed like someone who had finally reached a door that opened. 3 months later, Grace returned to the old storage room on the 42nd floor. But it no longer felt like a place where truth had been buried. The dust was gone. The broken light had been replaced. Margaret Whitmore's portrait had been cleaned and rehung, and beneath it stood a small glass case holding the silver pen, not as a weapon, not as a trophy, but as a promise. The engraved words were easy to read now. "For truth, not power." Grace stood before it for a long moment, remembering the first night she had found it, when her hands shook so badly she could barely fit the key into the safe. Back then, she had thought courage meant doing one huge brave thing and surviving it. Now she understood courage was quieter than that. It was showing up the next morning, reading one more file, taking one more call from someone who had no money and nowhere else to turn. The new legal aid program had already helped 42 families in 6 states. From a waitress in Missouri whose husband had hidden their savings, to a retired couple in Arizona nearly pushed out of their own small business by a greedy relative. Grace's father was receiving steady treatment now through her employee health plan, and every time he called her Madam Director, he laughed so hard he had to cough into a napkin. She never let Ethan pay his bills. She did let Ethan visit him once, carrying soup from a diner in Queens and looking more nervous than he had ever looked before a board meeting. Her father had studied him for 10 full seconds, then said, "So you are the billionaire my daughter keeps bossing around?" Ethan had smiled and answered, "Yes, sir. I am trying to improve." That was how love arrived between them. Not like lightning, not like a rescue, but like a light left on in a room someone was finally ready to enter. It was in late nights spent building policy, in coffee gone cold beside open case files, in Ethan learning to ask for help before loneliness hardened into silence, and in Grace learning that accepting kindness did not make her weak. Victoria's case moved through the courts without the glamour she once commanded. Her claim to the foundation was dismissed, her financial demands reduced under the agreement she had tried to deny, and the false statements she made under oath followed her far beyond the courthouse doors. Ethan did not celebrate her downfall. He simply stopped letting her name control the air around him. On a rainy Friday evening, Grace found him in Margaret's old office, standing by the window with a folder in his hands. "Another emergency case?" she asked. "Not exactly," he said. He handed it to her. Inside was a certificate establishing a permanent scholarship and legal support fund in her father's name, for working families facing medical debt during family court disputes. Grace read the words twice before she could speak. "Ethan, I told you not to repay me." "I am not repaying you," he said softly. "I am listening to you." Her eyes filled, and this time she did not look away. He stepped closer, careful, giving her all the space in the world. "You walked into court with a box of papers," he said. "But what you really carried was the one thing I had lost, the belief that truth still mattered." Grace looked past him to the city, bright and wet beneath the rain, then back to the man who no longer seemed trapped behind his own name. "Truth mattered," she said. "But so did what you chose to do after it saved you." Ethan smiled, small and real. A year later, the courthouse steps looked different in spring sunlight. No scandal. No shouting reporters. Just Ethan and Grace leaving a legal aid hearing where the foundation had won funding to expand nationwide. He reached for her hand and she let him take it. The building behind them had once been the place where everything almost ended. Now it was only a landmark they passed on the way to something honest, something earned, something neither of them had to perform. And in the lobby of Whitmore Tower, beneath Margaret's portrait, the silver pen remained behind glass, reminding everyone who saw it that power can buy silence for a while, but one honest person with one forgotten document can still change the whole story.